So as we continue to journey through this love story, it is on the surface a love story between a man and a woman, a husband to an unfaithful wife. Yet we know that this is a love story that is to be a picture of God's love for His people, which is ultimately a picture of God's love and God's pursuit of you. So we began our love story series with Hosea chapter 1, where God called Hosea, his prophet, to his people Israel, and says, go marry a wife of whoredom. Go marry a woman who's a known prostitute, a woman who's given herself over to sexual immorality as a lifestyle and as a way of survival. Love her, commit yourself to her, have children with her. And Hosea, by the way, time and time again, you will find that your wife will betray you, she will run from you, she will spurn your love, and she will break your heart. This Hosea is a picture of my relationship with my people Israel. How I brought them up out of bondage from the land of Egypt. I delivered them from slavery. I led them through the wilderness and I provided for them. I delivered them into a land that flows with milk and honey, a land that I promised to their father Abraham that would be theirs as an inheritance, an everlasting possession. I've established my covenant with Israel and I have kept my part of the covenant. But Israel had rejected the Lord and as the text said, had gone whoring after other gods and had played the part of the harlot or played the part of the prostitute. Was in a relationship with Yahweh, the God of heaven, yet spurned that relationship, rejected that love, and went and served the Baals and the gods of the Canaanites in the land in which they lived. And so we saw in week 1 the covenantal love of God, this love of God that pursues men and women based on His commitment to them, not on our commitment to God. In week 2, we saw the aspect when Paul Peralt came and spoke to you about the tough love of God. There are aspects of God's love where He will, in love, chasten you and go after you. He'll get your attention. He'll draw you to places where you will be broken before Him. God does that in love and in mercy. If God's ever just kind of blown up your life or God's ever just kind of blown up your world, He does that because He loves you and He's trying to get your attention. He's trying to draw you back to Himself. And then in that, what happens is we saw last week the tender love of God, as we saw the language of God calling to Israel, saying, I will draw you out into the wilderness. Remember when I drew you out of Egypt and I drew you into the wilderness, and there I will speak tenderly to you, and you will call me my husband. And then we saw this incredible language that reflects what we see in the New Testament as the relationship between Christ and His church, where we are called His bride. And so what we've seen throughout this prophecy in Hosea is there are some very real issues that Israel has in her relationship to God. And there are some very real covenantal promises, yet some covenantal curses that are going to come upon Israel. We see impending judgment. Yet couched in this story, couched in this life that Hosea is commanded to live with his wife Gomer, we see that narrative taking place, which is pointing to what's taking place currently then in Israel. But then what we see are these incredible promises that point to a future day. We see these promises, these prophecies that say and declare there is a coming day when you will call me my husband, and I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice and in steadfast love and in faithfulness. We saw that points to you and to I and the covenantal relationship that God gave and offers to us through the shed blood of His Son on a cross. And then we hit chapter 3. And as you'll notice and have noticed if you've been with us through this series, we have this narrative of Hosea and Gomer and their 3 children and the unfaithfulness of Hosea's wife Gomer to him. And then we break away from that and we talk about God's relationship with Israel, and then we break away from that and we talk about future promises. And this is kind of how the Old Testament prophets would write. There would oftentimes be a symbolic thing that they were asked to do. There would be a message to Israel at that day and then future promise. And so the minor prophets and the major prophets throughout the Old Testament kind of go with this flow. And it kind of goes back and forth and in and out, and the ancient Near Eastern way of communicating and writing was actually very different than our way. We're very linear and chronological, and everything has to be neat and orderly and in its place. Yet what you find in the ancient Near Eastern texts of the Old Testament is not that way at all. It kind of moves in and out of prophecy and in and out of Hosea's life and in and out of what God's doing with Israel back thousands of years ago. And it's not linear and chronological the way we'd like it to be, the way we think. And so what we find in chapter 3 is we pick up again the story of Hosea. And we know based on what we're going to read is that Hosea's wife Gomer had once again left Hosea and abandoned their 3 children. We're going to find out that Gomer, Hosea's wife, had become a victim of the sex slave industry of that day. She had lost her freedom, and she had become a slave to be sold to the highest bidder, to be used and abused. And so with that as the setting, and with Israel and her relationship with God as the backdrop to that setting, Israel was on the brink of slavery, of God's judgment upon the covenant curses falling upon her. And so with that as the backdrop, and with Gomer and Hosea as the setting to the story, we actually come to a very short chapter in this prophecy. Chapter 3, it's only 5 verses. But it says this, and the life of Hosea continues. And the Lord said to me, "Go again, love a woman who is loved by another man." What? Yeah, Hosea. Go again. Notice that word again. This wasn't something Hosea hadn't done already numerous times. Hosea, go again. And you can imagine this scene because Hosea had gone to his wife. He had brought her back in before. He had loved her. He had given himself to her. He had forgiven her numerous of times. And yet the word of the Lord to Hosea, Hosea, go again. Go again and love a woman who is currently, right now, being loved by another man and is an adulteress. Let the weight of what God is asking Hosea to fall on us this morning. Your wife, Hosea, has left you, is now being loved by another. She is an adulteress. Go again, Hosea. Go again, Hosea. Go again, and what? And love her. By this point, every one of us, if we knew Hosea, is this the advice we would give him? Hosea, go love her. I know she's abused you. I know she's abandoned your children and you. I know she's an adulteress and has sold herself into the sex slave industry. How many of us would sit down with our friend Hosea or our neighbor Hosea and say, hey, Hosea, go love her? Or how many of us would say, Hosea, cut her off. You don't have to put up with this anymore. You don't have to put up with this abuse. You don't have to take this anymore. Look at what she's doing to you, Hosea. Look what she's doing to your love. Look what she's doing to your children. Hosea, you need to be free from this woman. How many of us, that would be the advice that we would give? Well, of course. Who in their right mind would subject themselves to such abuse? To such betrayal, time and time and time and time again. And we sit here and we say, Hosea, are you mad? Why would you do this? And yet, what does the next part of this verse say? Love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, just as the Lord, what? Loves the children of Israel. Though they turn to other gods and love the cakes of raisins. Just as God loves Israel. Hosea, you are to go and love your wife, who is now an adulteress. Just as God loves his people. Just as his people have turned from God and played the part of the harlot and have played the part of the adulterous wife and have time and time and time again said, God, I don't want you. You're not enough. I need all of this. Time and time again, just as the Lord loves his people, Hosea, you go and you love your wife. Go find her. And how messy was that search? How heart-wrenching is that process? For Hosea to search for his wife. To go to the place where prostitutes are found. To go to the establishments where the sex slave industry is running its operation, to go down those streets, to go down those parts of town that the prophets of God were not supposed to go to, but to go to those messy places, to go, and I want you to put yourself in the feet or in the shoes of Hosea, walking those streets, searching for his wife who had left him. This is the setting of the story. This is what God's asking Hosea to do. And how difficult and how messy and how heart-wrenching is that search for his wife. And Hosea goes through town. And he goes through those parts of town that you're not supposed to go to. He goes to those places that the prophets of God normally didn't find themselves. And what does he do? He goes on a pursuit of his love. You see, this is a radical love story. Is it not? This is a radical love. Is it not? This is a love that pursues broken people. This is a love that forgives past sin. This is a radical love that pursues you and I. And how messy is it? And how heart-wrenching is it for Hosea to go on this journey in search for his wife who has betrayed him? But he says, Hosea, do this, even as the Lord, just as the Lord loves the children of Israel, even though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. That phrase, the cakes of raisins, had everything to do with the idolatrous worship of the Baal gods of the Canaanites. So this concept of these cakes and raisins wasn't so much a cake of raisin as much as it had to do with that aspect of the idolatrous, oftentimes sexually immoral pursuit of another god, who Israel would oftentimes find themselves worshiping God. And what they would do is they would still claim to be worshiping Yahweh, but when Yahweh didn't do what they thought Yahweh should do? Oftentimes what would happen is they would then betray their covenant with Yahweh, and then they would go and serve the Baals because, okay, Yahweh, if you're not going to do this for me, then we're going to go and we're going to search for that in another god. And so what they would do is they would combine the worship of Yahweh with the worship of Baal. And they would bring in the pagan, oftentimes sexually immoral, idolatrous worship of the Baal into the temple, along with the worship of Yahweh. This is what Israel has done. And yet, with radical grace and radical love, God says, Hosea, love her as I love them. So verse 2. So I bought her. What? She's your wife, Hosea. What does the verse say? So I bought her. But Hosea, she's your wife. She's already yours. You married her. You made a commitment to her. You brought her into her home, your home. Hosea, she's yours. She's already your wife. What do you mean you had to buy her back? And what was this scene like? As Hosea wanders these streets and finds himself at a slave auction, and there on the block is his wife, the mother of his children. How much? Says Hosea. How much? I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a letek of barley. That doesn't mean much to us today, but that was probably all of Hosea's life savings. Probably about 500 pounds of barley. All that he had. How much? All that you have. I'll take it all. But wasn't she already his? Wasn't she already his? Like, how does it make sense that Hosea had to purchase something that was already his? And yet what we see this pointing to ultimately is this truth that 2,000 years ago, the God of the universe paid the ultimate price for you and me. Yet we know that the Bible says the earth is whose? The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. This is God's prized possession. It's His creation. Yet 2,000 years ago, the God of the universe, wanting to redeem men and women, said, how much? How much? Because what Jesus had to do was purchase back what was already his. And what would have been Gomer's response in that setting? As she stood on the slave block and sees her husband, whom she had left, whom she had betrayed, stand there in the crowd and say, how much? And then give all that he had to buy her back. Did she deserve it? Nope. But what we're seeing here in this Old Testament story is a radical grace that produces a radical love. Imagine the shame of Gomer as she hung her head on that slave block. The man that I had left, I had abandoned our children. I've been giving myself to other men night after night after night. Found myself now the possession of another with no freedom. I'm a slave. Imagine how she hung her head in shame in that moment. You see, I argue that this was an actual event that actually took place. God was using this life that God had commanded Hosea to live to speak a crucial and an important and a radical message to the people of Israel at that day, and yes, to us even today. That this event, it took place in time and space. And imagine Gomer standing there, watching this scene, thinking about what her husband had done, and remembering how all of these other men, all of these other individuals that she had been with, they wanted her to abuse her, but now Hosea comes back and he wants to buy her so that he can heal her. And don't miss what's happening here. So oftentimes we give ourselves to that which we think will satisfy us, yet all that leaves us with is brokenness. Like sin will break you. Disobedience and abandoning God will leave you broken. It will leave you hurting. It will leave you in pain. It will leave you in guilt. And this world and Satan and the enemy wants you so that he can use you. And Jesus is coming to you saying, I want you so that I can heal you. Because sin breaks us, and sin leaves us barren and naked before God, just as Gomer found herself on that slave block. And yet Hosea comes in with a radical love and a radical grace and says, how much? How much? All that you have, here it is. Hosea takes the money and takes the barley and he gives it as payment. And he looks his wife in the eye in verse 3 and says to her, you must dwell as mine. I've bought you back, Gomer, not to use you, but to heal you, to love you, to make you my own. You must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore or belong to another man, and so will I also be to you. You're mine again, Gomer. No longer the possession of another. No longer loved by another. You're mine, Gomer. You're my wife. You will live with me, and you will dwell with me, and you will be healed, and you will no longer play the part of the whore. You will commit to me, and I will remain faithful to you. And then in verse 4, we jump right back into prophecy again. For the children of Israel shall dwell many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household gods. For there's a coming day, speaking to Israel, there's a coming day when you will be stripped of all that you have. You will be removed from the land. You will not have king. You will not have a place of worship. All right, you'll be stripped. That's what the idea of the pillar and the ephod, which was part of what the priestly garment was. You'll not even have household gods in your home. There's a coming day, Israel. This will be stripped away from you. So he's going back in and he's referencing coming judgment. And we know that judgment came when the Assyrian Empire came and removed the northern kingdom of Israel and took her over. And then when the Babylonians came in and removed the southern kingdom of Judah. That God had kept his covenantal promises, but Israel had not, and so they were removed from the land. And their temple was destroyed. And she was without all of these things. But there's a verse 5. It says, afterward. After what? After this period of time. After this period of time when you don't have a king and you don't have a house of worship. Now, we know that Israel was in captivity for 70 years, and then there was a return back to the land, right? There was a rebuilding of the wall and a rebuilding of the city. And then there was 400 years of silence. You see, that time period between what we call our Old and our New Testament is 400 years. When there was not a prophetic word from God. There was no prophet speaking on behalf of Yahweh to Israel. Yes, there were kings. Yes, there was a temple rebuilt. But there was no word from God. We call these the 400 silent years. So from the time that Hosea prophesied to what we see happening in the events of our New Testament, it was 750 years. 400 of which there was no prophetic word from God. And what we see happening in the beginning of the New Testament is we see Israel, yes, was back in her land. Yes, had rebuilt her temple, but was ruled by a Roman Empire. Yes, they were given a king, Herod, but Herod had nothing to do with Yahweh of the Old Testament. Herod was a puppet of Rome, not God's king. So afterward, what's he pointing to? Well, let's see what he says afterward. There's coming a day. The children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God, and who? And David, their king. There's a coming day, Hosea is saying, when Israel will return. You will be brought back as my people. You'll seek the Lord your God. You'll no longer play the part of the whore. You'll no longer play the part of Gomer. You'll come, there's a coming day. You'll come back. You will seek the Lord your God and David your king. Now we know at this point that David was dead, right? Is he prophesying a future resurrection of King David? What's he pointing to? He's pointing back to 2 Samuel 7, where God promised David that David, from you, from your family, from your seed will come a king. From you, David, will come one who will sit on the throne of my people and to sit on your throne forever. And God's pointing to his Messiah, and it's pointing to a greater son of David, pointing to David's greater son, David's greater heir, pointing to someone who would come and be their king forever. What he's pointing to is a day of salvation. He's pointing to a day of salvation when David's greater son would come. When our Hosea would come. You see, church, this Hosea is a picture of God, and we are a picture of Gomer. And our Hosea has come, and where we have found ourselves in slavery to sin, and where we have found ourselves pursuing in an idolatrous way our own wicked desires, our Hosea has come. And so what did that look like? That looked like Jesus. Jesus coming down into the messiness of this world, leaving the glories of heaven, leaving the glory of the Father to descend to the messiness of this earth, to walk the streets that Hosea walked in search for his wife, to walk the streets where there was pain and deceit and murders and wickedness and lust, that Jesus came into those spaces, and Jesus came into the messiness that was this world, and he came searching and pursuing his people, you and me. And God the Father said, how much? How much? The blood of your Son. The life of your Son. Very well. Very well, I will send my Son into this mess of sin and brokenness. And as Hosea went searching for his wife, so Jesus came to the darkness of sinful man searching for you. And when God found you, just as Gomer, don't think that you were so nice and orderly and neat and cleaned up and your life was all together, right? When God found you, you were a broken mess, just like Gomer. Sure, you can clean up the outside. You can try and live a moral life. But when you lay your head down on your pillow at night, you know the type of person that you are. And that should haunt you. Because there's sin, right? There's selfishness. There's lust. There's lies. There's bitterness. There's anger. There's all of these things. Listen, we were not so nice and orderly and good when Jesus found us, when Jesus found you on that slave block. But he said, how much? And Jesus redeemed you, and catch this, church, so that he could heal you. And that's what the redeeming love of God does, doesn't it? The redeeming love of God takes you in your brokenness, takes you in your sin, and he draws you to himself and he heals you. Like the church is a place where there is healing. The church is a place where there should be hope. Why has the church at times become a place of pain and struggle and difficulty? If we have the same God that said to Hosea, Hosea, go love a woman who is now currently an adulteress. Just as Jesus loves you, the church should be a place where we are healed, not where we are hurt. The church should be a place where we find hope, not despair. That should be the glorious church of Christ, not because we have it all together, but because we serve a king, David's greater son, King Jesus, who purchased us with his blood so he could draw us out of our sin and darkness and say, I want to heal you. I want to heal you. At the cost of the shedding of his blood, he takes you and me and he redeems us. And so when God looked down upon sinful men and women, and he sent Jesus to pay the price, how much was it? The death of your son. To satisfy the wrath, the just wrath of a holy God, it took the perfect sacrifice, a spotless lamb. That's how much. And if you finish out this chapter, it says, and they shall come in to fear the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days. So the promise is, because Israel knew the fear of the Lord, and at this time the fear of the Lord was terror. If you don't do this, you will be judged. Yet there's a coming day, Hosea says. There's a coming day when you shall come into the fear of the Lord, and you will not stand in terror, but what? You will stand in awe of his what? What's it say? His goodness. How good is God to you? How good has God been to you? That what this is pointing to, that as the Apostle Paul says now, that we live in these latter days or these last days, this time period in which we live, in which God comes to us and says, stand in awe, not of my judgment, but stand in awe of my goodness. Because we all found ourselves on the slave block. We did. Maybe you're standing there today still on that slave block. You're a slave. You're not free, and you know it. You maybe have cleaned up the outside, but you know in your heart that you're still a slave to sin. So the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 6, verse 6, we know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would be no longer, what? Enslaved to sin. For one who has died has been set free from sin. Now, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we also will live with him. We know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. For the death he died to sin once for all, but the life he lives to God. So you must consider yourselves what? Dead to sin and alive to Jesus. The Apostle Paul talks in terms of slavery. And I want you to read with me, or listen as I read, verse 17 of Romans 6. But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin, you who were slaves, have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed. And here's the glorious truth of the redeeming love of God. Verse 18, Romans 6, and having been set free from sin, have become what? Slaves of righteousness. That what God did when he said, how much? And he sent his son to shed his blood, is he pulled you off the slave block of sin and made you his own. This is the redeeming love of God. This is what motivates us to do what we do. This is what drives us in spite of the struggle with sin that we have now, in spite of the turmoil of life, in spite of whoever gets elected on Tuesday. This is what motivates us. This is what drives us. That we stood on that slave block and Jesus said, how much? I'll take you and I'll heal you. And so you may be struggling with sin. You may have been purchased from that slave block, but you find yourself struggling, wandering from God. You know the same promise is true for you. You've been bought with a price. You've been bought. You've been purchased. Come back and be declared a child of God.